So if it were my wife, I'm not sure that she would get very far out the door in terms of launching court cases about who said what about who. Welcome to this week's edition of One-to-One with Simon Jordan. Don't forget to keep liking and subscribing, and equally as importantly, to leaving your questions in the comment section below. But let's get to this week's show and answer your questions. I have desperately tried to turn the television off every time I've seen the WAGATHA Christie trial. Obviously, my partner works in the media, she works in news, so she's having to cover some of this stuff. And each of us equally sit there saying, what are these two ghastly women actually doing? I think what it means for their two husbands is they should actually stop for a second and say, ladies, we're going to stop funding this nonsense, pack it in, enough now, it's embarrassing, it's unnecessary. It's sad that we're seeing this sort of thing occupy space and time. These two women need to grow up, pull themselves together. There's far more pressing things in the world, isn't there, than their egos, their narcissistic views of the world, and what they think they're entitled to. So if it were my wife, I'm not sure that she would get very far out the door in terms of launching court cases about who said what about who. This Erling Haaland question about what he's going to do and what he's not going to do. Timo Werner landed in this country with a huge reputation and a prolific goal-scoring record in Germany. We'll see what Haaland's going to do. I expect him to do well. I expect him to make an impact, because Man City very rarely buy bad players, and he is most certainly not a bad player. We will see how he adjusts to the Premier League. We will see how he plays against a far more competitive league than the league that he plays in. As far as who would finish in front of him, well, the usual suspects. You know, Harry Kane's not going to stop scoring goals because Erling Haaland's arrived at Man City. Sadio Mane's not going to stop scoring goals. And a list of other strikers that we can talk about. You would hope that if Romelu Lukaku stays at Chelsea, which is unlikely, he might do us a favour and score a few goals for Chelsea. But what it will do is it will put a new dimension to Manchester City. And it will be an interesting one, because he's not Aguero, he's a real centre forward in terms of a big target man, and it'll be interesting to see how Man City adapt, or how he adapts to Manchester City. And it will be also fascinating to see if he is what we all think he is, this absolutely outstanding talent that's going to take up the mantra of Lewandowski and people of that, or the mantle more to the point. So it all brings more intrigue to the Premier League and more power to it. I have to be honest about the Champions League. I have mixed emotions about it, because first of all, I find it a contradiction in terms, because 90% of the teams in it aren't actually champions. So I start from a default setting of sort of screwing my brow up, saying this is the tournament that's born out of UEFA putting control over football and monetising it. But if I'm forced to look at what is the most compelling comeback, and I know there's a variety of games that one can look at, I think it's the 2005 final between Liverpool and AC Milan, from Liverpool coming back from the position of being 3-0 down. I think that's difficult to argue against, because it's the biggest stage with the most amount of pressure, and a final that was going one way. So that's my take. Others will have a variety of other games that involve Barcelona and PSG, but because it's a final, to me, and not because it's Liverpool, with this love in from the media apparently about Liverpool, but because it was a final, and because it was such a monumental recovery in a cause that was lost. So it's Liverpool versus AC Milan. This idea that you can suggest that one is more losing KANE or losing CONTE, which one would you lose the most from? Well, one's a manager and one's a player. So you're not comparing on an equal footing. If you're looking at what the team could lose from not having KANE there, which by the way is not an option because Kane's going to be there. So I would say we never know what you're going to get with Conte. You never know what the landscape buys. If you're Tottenham Hotspur and you have a particular agenda, which is you want Conte, you want him to manage on a certain basis, you have certain expectations of him, and you have a certain budget, and he doesn't want to play nicely within the confines of that, then losing KANE would be a bigger loss, because KANE might be someone that doesn't cause you problems. It depends upon the relativity of the question. I personally think if Conte is committed to the cause, and the cause meets his expectations, and by that I mean that Daniel gives him the prerequisite amount of support, which is fair and equitable based upon their ideals for the achievements they want from him, that Conte in the longer game would be the loss, because if they can build Conte into staying somewhere for more than 2 years, and he can build a team that can compete regularly, repeatedly in amongst the Champions League, and that's going to supersede the individual achievements of Harry Kane, who in the next couple of years will be coming to the sort of twilight years in his career. So Conte, if he is what we think he is, he can build a legacy at Tottenham that embraces the stadium, embraces the opportunity that they didn't take in 2018 or 2019, whenever it was, when they lost in the Champions League final. So I think Conte, if he is focused correctly, will be the bigger loss, if they were to lose either, which I don't think they will. So the question is, who's my favourite player? And it kind of, for me, it's a difficult one to answer, because there's so many good players and so many different attributes and so many different people doing different jobs in different positions. You know, I grew up as a young man when I signed for Chelsea at 15 as a winger, so I look at wingers sometimes. I look at teams. Who is the team that I enjoy the most? And here it goes, and the media bias can now come in people's minds. The team I enjoy watching the most is Liverpool. I think you can make arguments for some of the players within the confines of Liverpool of potentially occupying the space. I'm a big fan of this boy Diaz. I think it's too early to say whether he's my favourite player of the season, but I think he's an outstanding performer. But off the top of my head, because I'm so focused on what the team's doing, and my motivations are to see an outcome that is honest and players doing their jobs and players... Honestly, if I was to pick a player, it will surprise people. I would pick Conor Coady. I think even though Wolves are not a club that I'm a great fan of, but I admire them for their achievements in the past and I admire them for what they're doing this season, Conor Coady just, I don't know, he's a modern day footballer. I've seen some things about him recently. I saw him picking up a young kid on the side of a video when he came off the pitch. I see the honesty of his contribution in the media. I see the integrity in which he plays the game. And whilst it's not creative and whilst it's not beautiful in the eye, I kind of like it. And I kind of like, in this modern day age of flighty footballers that don't seem to have much substance, he seems to have a lot. And then you look at the other side of the argument about beautiful players that are great to watch. And we have an embarrassment of riches in the Premier League. If I'm looking at my old club, yeah, Conor Gallagher's an argument, done really well. If you look at Tottenham, yeah, Son's been outstanding. But it's kind of those things that I look at. So whether that's a great answer or not, that's my answer. Man United, for me, still remain, from an iconic point of view, the biggest club. And nowhere near on the pitch. And that should be the argument we're having. We should be having a debate, who is the biggest club based upon their performance? And it's not Man United. Man United, for me, represent an era that's changed the landscape of football, that's changed it beyond recognition. The advent of the Premier League, from its inception in '92 through to what it's created in terms of the quality of players coming in the league, the kind of finances that players can now get in their wages, the type of owners that we've got, and all the challenges that that's brought, have been brought on the watch of the poster boys of the Premier League for a significant period of time, which were Man United. Now the world has turned, and United still occupy enormous precedence. They still occupy more column inches than any other football club, and it tends to be the way that sometimes when things aren't going the way you want them to, you get more attention. When Arsenal were doing dreadfully, Arsenal Fan TV tragically profited by those sort of reactions. But I still think that if Man United regain their poise, they will be the club that people look at. They will be the club that players aspire to play for. That will not sit well with the Man Cities of the world and the Chelseas of the world, because they'll not want to hear that. But unfortunately, in people's minds, and it's not just my generation, there is a perception about Man United which is not backed up by their deeds in the last 10 years, that they are the biggest club in the world. And from a brand reputation, from an emotional investment, whether you throw it back because of the unique iconography of the tragedy in 1958 through to the fabulous players that won the European Cup in 1968 with George Best and Bobby Charlton, all the way through to what we've seen, which is the class of '92, the Alex Ferguson era, you can't argue that United have sort of made this indelible footprint. They are doing their level best to wipe out that imagery. They're doing their level best to make sure people perceive them differently, but it's still very difficult to argue that pound for pound, and we're stripping sort of titles and cups out of it for the last half a decade, or maybe even a decade now, United still, in most people's eyes, besides those that support Manchester City and those that support Liverpool, I suspect, is probably the biggest brand in world football, up there in a unique space with Madrid and Barcelona and a couple of other football clubs. So tragically, for people that don't like this answer, it probably is that United are still the biggest club in the world, but they certainly are not based upon their performances in the last 10 years. So that's it for this week's edition of One-to-One. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts on WAGATHA CHRISTIE trial, HAALAND, and of course Manchester United. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Don't forget to keep liking and subscribing and leaving your questions in the comment section below.